In 1700, a ship limped into the harbor at Cartagena. On board were the survivors. 300 of them, skeletal, diseased, defeated. They were all that remained of an expedition that had left Scotland 2 years earlier with 2,500 colonists, 5 ships, and the combined savings of an entire nation. The man responsible wasn't on that ship. He was back in London, safe, already planning his next venture. His name was William Paterson, and by the time of his death, he would be remembered as both the founder of the Bank of England and the architect of Scotland's greatest catastrophe. This is the story of how one man helped create the modern financial system, convinced a small nation to bet everything on a jungle, and accidentally erased that nation from the map. Let's start with a number. Between 25 and 50%. That how much of Scotland's total available capital was invested in a single colonial venture in 1698. Imagine if, tomorrow, Americans put half of every dollar they had into one company, one idea, one man's vision. That's what Scotland did. And to understand why, you have to understand William Paterson. Born around 1658 in a farmhouse in Dumfriesshire, Scotland. Paterson spent his 20s doing something unusual for a Scottish farm boy. He was traveling the Caribbean, the American colonies, Amsterdam, London. He was watching, learning how money moved across oceans, how empires were really built. Not with soldiers, with credit. By his 30s, Paterson had figured something out. The Dutch were rich not because they had gold mines. They were rich because they had invented a new kind of institution, a national bank, a place where the government could borrow money from its own citizens, pay them interest, and use that money to fund wars, ships, and colonies. England didn't have one, and England was losing. The 9 Years' War against France was bleeding the treasury dry. King William III needed cash. Desperately, Paterson had an idea. Here's how the Bank of England was born. Pay attention, because this mechanism still runs the world. Paterson proposed a simple deal. A group of wealthy merchants and aristocrats would lend the English government £1.2 million. In exchange, they would receive 8% annual interest paid by the government, and they would be granted a royal charter to operate as a bank. That's it. That's the whole trick. The government got money it didn't have. The lenders got guaranteed income backed by the state. And the new bank could now issue notes, take deposits, and lend money to others, multiplying its influence far beyond that original 1.2 million. The Bank of England opened its doors in 1694. Within 11 days, the entire subscription was filled. Paterson was a founding director. He was 40 years old, and he had just helped invent central banking. But here's the thing about William Paterson. He wasn't satisfied. He didn't want to be a banker in London. He wanted to be an empire builder. He had a bigger idea, a much bigger idea, and it was completely insane. Look at a map of Panama, that narrow strip of land connecting North and South America. Now imagine you're a Scottish merchant in 1695. Your country has no colonies, no navy to speak of. England keeps blocking your trade. You're poor, you're angry, and you're desperate. Now imagine a man walks into Edinburgh with a proposal. We're going to establish a colony right there. On the Isthmus of Darien, the crossroads of the world. Spanish galleons carrying Peruvian silver. They'll pass through our port. English ships loaded with Asian spices. They'll stop at our docks. We won't need to sail around Cape Horn or the Cape of Good Hope. We'll control the shortcut. Scotland will become the trading hub of two hemispheres. That was Paterson's pitch, and Scotland bought it. Literally. The Company of Scotland trading to Africa and the Indies was founded in 1695. Originally, it was supposed to be a joint English-Scottish venture. English investors had pledged £300,000. But then King William, pressured by the East India Company and English merchants who didn't want competition, forced the English investors to withdraw. Scotland was on its own, and Scotland went all in. The subscription books opened in Edinburgh on February 26, 1696. In 6 months, £400,000 had been pledged. Lords, lawyers, merchants, widows, small farmers, people mortgaged their homes, sold their cattle. The Duchess of Hamilton put in £3,000. The town of Glasgow contributed collectively. This wasn't just an investment, it was a national act of defiance, a declaration that Scotland didn't need England. In July 1698, the first 5 ships set sail from Leith, carrying 1,200 colonists. Paterson himself was on board, though not in charge. He'd been ousted from the company leadership after a colleague embezzled a significant sum. Still, he went along a true believer in his own vision. The mood was euphoric. Crowds cheered them off. Scotland's future was finally in its own hands. They landed in Panama in November and named their new home Caledonia and their settlement New Edinburgh. Paterson's grand vision seemed to be coming true. But dreams don't survive contact with reality. And the reality of the Darien jungle was brutal. The colonists had brought the wrong supplies. They had packed heavy woolen clothes, perfect for a Scottish winter, but useless in the tropical heat. Their trade goods wigs, stockings, and Bibles were of no interest to the local Kuna people. The soil, which Paterson had described as rich, was a swamp. Crops failed. The harbour, meant to welcome the world's fleets, was a shallow, indefensible bay. And then came the diseases. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. 10 people were dying every day. Within months, the vibrant colony was a graveyard. To make matters worse, they were not alone. This land was claimed by Spain, the most powerful empire in the world, and King William of England, not wanting to provoke Spain, ordered all English colonies in the Americas, Jamaica, New York, Barbados not to trade with or assist the Scottish settlers in any way, abandoned by their king, blockaded by the Spanish, and ravaged by disease. The first expedition lasted just 8 months. In July 1699, the few hundred survivors abandoned New Edinburgh and sailed for home. But here's the truly tragic part. Back in Scotland, they didn't know. Communication took months. A second expedition, even larger than the first, with 1,300 more colonists, had already set sail. They arrived to find a ghost town. Decaying huts, overgrown graves. A scene of total desolation. They tried to rebuild, but it was hopeless. The Spanish, seeing their weakness, finally closed in. In March 1700, after a brief siege, the Scots surrendered. It was over. The survivors who weren't taken prisoner by the Spanish scattered. Some, like the men on that ship in Cartagena, ended up in English colonies. Most never made it back to Scotland. Of the 2,500 people who had set out with such high hopes, only a few hundred ever saw home again. The financial fallout was cataclysmic. Scotland was bankrupt. Not just the government, but the people, the lords, the merchants, the farmers who had bet their life savings all ruined. The nation was on its knees, its spirit broken. The dream of a Scottish empire had died in a Panamanian swamp, and this is where the story turns. England saw an opportunity. For years, they had wanted a full political union with Scotland to secure their northern border and unify the island. But Scotland had always resisted, fiercely protective of its independence, but now they were desperate. England offered a deal. A treaty of union. And as part of that deal, England offered to pay. They offered a sum of money, called the equivalent, to compensate the Scottish investors who had lost everything in the Darien scheme. It was, in effect, a bailout, but it came at a price. In 1707, the Scottish Parliament voted to dissolve itself. The Kingdom of Scotland ceased to exist. It became part of a new entity, Great Britain. The Darien disaster didn't just bankrupt Scotland, it ended it as an independent nation. And what about William Paterson? He had survived, barely. He lost his wife and child to fever in Darien and returned to London a broken man. But he wasn't done. He spent years lobbying the new British government to be compensated for his own losses. He eventually was then went on to propose other grand financial schemes, even suggesting a new version of the Darien Plan, this time under British control. He died a wealthy man in 1719, remembered in England as a financial genius, the father of the Bank of England. In Scotland, his legacy is far more complicated. The dreamer who led his country to ruin. The story of the Darien scheme is a cautionary tale about the dangers of national pride, bad planning, and putting all your eggs in one basket. It's a story of how a single, brilliant, and deeply flawed idea can change the course of history. It shows that the lines between genius and madness, between visionary and fool, are often terrifyingly thin. It's a forgotten chapter of history that built the world we live in today. A world shaped by national banks, global trade, and the ghosts of failed empires. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the weird and wonderful corners of history. See you next time.